Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Y'all have to excuse me, I'm probably gonna smile very hard this whole time. It's been a while since I've given a presentation, but I'm glad to be giving this one today. Okay. All right, let me get myself together. So today I will be presenting on the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background, but it starts actually here at work. Okay, it was a few months ago that we had an assignment to basically create buttons for the suffrage movement. And so the buttons were pretty much kind of already created. They were cut out with different women who helped to support the vote, to get the vote out for women. And one of the women on the buttons was Ida B. Wells. And I was curious because I knew Ida B. Wells to be somebody who was an activist, somebody who supported the anti-lynching movement and campaigns. However, I didn't know her so much to be a suffragist. And so what I did was I looked her up on YouTube. And I looked at a bit of a documentary featuring Ida B. Wells. And so throughout the documentary, I learned more about her process, where she came from. But there was a word that I heard specifically in the clip, and that word was Black Women's Club, Black Women's Clubs. And when I heard it, I was shocked because I had never heard of Black Women's Clubs before. You all kind of hear of all the education that I've gotten and that I'm still actually pursuing, but I had never heard of the term Black Women's Clubs. So I wanted to know more about it. This is a picture of Ida B. Wells and all the work that she did. I just kind of mentioned some of the things that she did. We'll learn more about her throughout the presentation. So when I went to look up Black Women's Clubs, the club that popped up as the first and most dominant club was the National Association of Colored Women. What I would like for you to know that is that this is, of course, not the only Black Women's Club. There were a host of Black Women's clubs at this time, but the National Association of Colored Women was the one that was the most predominant. What I found out about the club is that it was created through a set of circumstances and by a group of groups that were already functioning, doing social work and civil work in the community in particular. So how did it get started in particular? There were a set of circumstances in this country in which things were not fair for the African American community. That's probably kind of an understatement, but excuse me. So the time that they opened up was 1896. And in 1896, that's when they discovered a letter that had been written. This letter had been written by a gentleman by the name of Mr. James W. Jack, and he's also known as Jim in some publications. But he had written a letter about Black people in particular, and the letter was a letter in protest to the lynching movement, okay, the anti-lynching movement. Ida B. Wells was the person who was heading the lynching movement campaign, and Mr. Jacks was upset about the anti-lynching. Okay, and what he decided to do was to write a letter. And he wrote a letter saying that Black people didn't deserve the freedom that they were asking for, basically denigrating the Black race as a whole. But in particular, he denigrated Black women. And he called Black women prostitutes, thieves, and liars by nature. Okay? So when this word got out, like I said, there were already Black women's clubs. However, they were serving individually across the country, their different communities, and they decided that they needed to rally. One woman in particular decided that she wanted to get involved and do something about it. And her name is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. And what Ms. Ruffin did was she used a publication that she already had been the editor of, which was called The Women's Era. and she sent out basically a call of action to the women in the community or across the country to do something about this letter, to defend the character of Black women. It was to her something of high importance, and it was something that could not be, it couldn't be slid under the rug, so it had to be addressed. Okay. That's Miss Ruffin right there in the center. To the right, you can see with the glasses on. Okay, she was the one, like I said, she had the, she already had the periodical called The Women's Era, The Woman's Era. And also right here to the left, we have Mary Church Terrell. In the top corner, we have Harriet Tubman. Down here at the bottom, we have Margaret Murray Washington, Frances E.W. Harper, who the Little Rock chapter of the Arkansas Association Colored Women's Club is named after. And then at the top, we have Ida B. Wells. Let me explain that this, when you look up the co-founders of the Black Women's Club, it can kind of get complicated. And one of the reasons why it can get complicated is because what I tried to explain in the beginning is there were already women's clubs, Black women's clubs that had been created, but they were working on things separately in their own state, in their own community, on their own issues, things that they cared about in particular. But once that letter came out by, what I didn't mention is that Mr. Jacks, James W. Jacks, or Jim W. Jacks, was the president of the Missouri Press Association. And so when he sent that letter out, it had a lot of power, it had a lot of clout. He was able to send it out to people who had a lot of influence. Not only did he send it out to different articles or publications across the country, he also sent it to England. And keep in mind, this letter is bad-mouthing Black people. And like I said, in particular, it was bad-mouthing women. So once that letter came out, it was Miss Ruffin here, Miss Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who put out an actual, a call to action in her periodical called The Women's Era. Okay. A little bit of background about Miss Ruffin. Miss Ruffin was the daughter of an English woman, and her father was a man from the islands, and he was basically a clothier, or however, a person who made clothes. And he was very, very successful. So she came from quite a privileged background, okay? So she was contacted actually by someone in England who was working on the anti-lynching program in England, and said, we have this letter, and we think it's important for you to address. And speaking of addressing, I'll address the relationship between England and Black people and the movement to end lynching. It also kind of derives out of the whole movement against slavery. Black Americans had a particular share of help from the UK to help get things done. So it was out of that same vein and that same relationship that helped to end slavery that also helped to bring awareness to the lynching problem that we had in this country. So a woman from the UK contacted Mrs. Pierre and told her about the letter. Again, she got with different women who were leaders of organizations in the Black women community. So you have Harriet Tubman. I'm sure you all have probably heard of Harriet Tubman. She helped free over 300 slaves, having had freed herself. And you have Miss Margaret Murray Washington. You may not have heard of her, but I'm sure you've heard of her husband, Booker T. Washington. And then you have Miss Ida B. Wells. Like I said, Miss Ida B. Wells, she's a staunch woman. She was a very courageous woman, and she didn't take anything off of anybody. She championed this anti-lynching movement. And then you have Frances E.W. Harper. And what I can say about her is she was a very mild-mannered woman in a lot of respects, but she was a poet. She was talented at writing and communicating her message. So these women came together and they created the Federation of Afro-American Women. Okay. They created, the Federation of African American Women. And their whole goal was to pool these black women who have been working in these separate clubs together to put their power, their money, and their resources forward in order to make things better for the black community. One of the things that I want to point out before I move on to the next slide is the way that some of these women look in particular. You see these two women in the middle. Oh, by the way, Mary Church Terrell, her father, she's from mixed race background, but her father was known as the first black millionaire of the South, okay? So we have women here who are privileged. They're privileged economically, they're privileged in their skin tone. You might know that the lighter you are at this time, and arguably at this time too, in terms of colorism, the higher you can travel vertically, socially, it could be a bit easier for you. So that's an issue as well, that is a thing. So these women got together, and I want to pull out some of the context behind the time in which they got together. This is 1895, by the way, okay? This is 1895, and what's happening in 1895, or by 1895, is that you have the women's movement that already took place. The women's movement happened in the middle of the 1800s, but black women were not necessarily included in a lot of the women's clubs at that time. There were a few. You had the WCTU, which is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Thank you. I knew you were over there to help me out. And so there were a few organizations that they could join, but the whole point of the women's movement was for women to be able to have enough power to mobilize themselves in a way in which they felt like they wanted to. It was about self-empowerment. Before this, the clubs that women typically joined were A, either run by men, or B, run by women within the church. So this women's movement was about secular clubs. So if you wanted to do sewing, if you wanted to do self-improvement, certain ways, if you wanted to read, learn how to do poetry or crochet, whatever their interest may be. But the black women's movement happened at the end of the 1800s. So that was happening. 1895, we are roughly 30 years out of slavery, okay? So that means we're also at the beginning of Jim Crow to a certain extent. It hadn't really reached its full-blown status, but there were definitely some laws that were created to segregate the races by that time. Like I said, we had the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. However, what the 13th Amendment also did was allow for an easier form of slavery known as mass incarceration. And so there were a lot of young black men who were being incarcerated in mass numbers, and that was an issue in the black community. Lynching, like I've mentioned before, this anti-lynching campaign was going on, but lynching was a problem. Lynching was not necessarily addressed on the national level. There were lots of states in the South, particularly Texas and Alabama, and also Arkansas, who had high numbers of lynching, but like I said, it was not a national problem at that time, and that was something that the women wanted to bring to the forefront. Also, black people at this time are in a unique position. They were once, they belonged to somebody, maybe a generation ago, maybe not even a generation ago at this time. So how do you compose yourself, and how do you operate as a free person? And what does it mean to be a free person? And what does it mean to be a person who's trying to navigate where there are laws being placed upon you, trying to actually hinder that on a regular basis? And also I want to let you know, like I said, there were different organizations that took place, and black women could not participate in the women's clubs, but there were lots of other clubs in the African American community at that time that did exist, some of them dating back even to 1780. Clubs I had never heard of before, so I'm going to call out a couple of names because I found it interesting. You had the Academy of the American Negro, the Convention of Colored Men, the Afro-American Protective League, the American Association of Educators of Colored Youth, the Colored Press Convention, the National Federation of Colored Men. So there was a lot already happening and taking place in terms of movement in terms of gathering and mobilizing around causes in the African American community. So those are the social conditions that I just mentioned. You got lynching, you have, I don't know if you can see from the very back, but in this middle picture you have a group of very young black men who are mass incarcerated, and of course there's an image of Jim Crow. The infamous letter by James Jack, Anti-Lynching, 1895 is when the letter came out. And so that's Ida B. Wells again. And the reason why I want to bring up Ida B. Wells here at this point is because, and we'll be mindful of my time, is because Ida was such a force. Ida, not only was she a journalist, but when Ida was in her early 20s, or she was 20 actually, she was a teacher in Memphis, Tennessee, because she's from Memphis. And she would take the train back and forth to help teach, to help equip not just the students, but the teachers as well. And when she was on the train, she was sitting in the rear of the train. But the rear of the train back then was more like first class. So the front of the train was for people who would get drunk and cuss and smoke. It was no place for a lady, quote unquote, this is what it says. But when she was on the train, she was asked by the conductor to move. And she said no. And basically, he physically removed her off the train and tried to put her in the front of the train. She protested, and she, instead of getting on the front, she got off the train. She was about a mile away from where she was trying to get to. But she went on to sue the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroads in 1884, and she won. Okay, so this is 1884. This is before Rosa. This is before you have situations like this. However, the Supreme Court they overturned it in an appeal. But that just goes to show she was 20 years old, and that's what she was made out of. So she was very ruthless in her journalism. She did investigative journalism, and lynching back in the day was considered justified because. The thoughts were that black men could not control their sexual prowess. They would look at white women and they would be a threat to the white community. And so what she did is she tried to get to the bottom of why lynching actually did occur, which some of the reasons she found was because of fear of getting ahead financially, if they were developing well, doing well economically, and just a place of power to be able to put basically black people in a position where they felt like they could not come up out of their social conditions, to kind of keep them down. So what she did in turn was she went to England, and she went to England basically to tell on America, go to America's parent and to tell on them and say, this is what's really happening. Okay, at this time, this is it's in the 1880s, put it like that. It's in the 1880s. And remember, we became a country in 1776. So we were about 100 or so, maybe 110, maybe less than that. But to put that in reference, this building is over 180 years old. Okay, so she went to America's mama and was like, they're cutting up, they're acting up, you really need to come and get your kids, they're killing us. And they didn't believe it, but eventually they came around to see that what she was doing she was fighting for a worthy cause, and it was actually true. So I said all that to say that letter started the National Association of Colored Women. That's Ms. Pierre again. In her publication, she said, let's confer, let's get together. So there was a call to convene. She had a publication, so she already had a way to pay for it, and she was the editor of a magazine to let people across the country know what was going on. And that's where, like I said, where it began. So there was a call to action. Here's a picture of the National Association of Colored Women. It's a collection of different presidents throughout the years. Okay. So what I want to bring up is, before we go into that, I want to let you know that that first meeting in 1895 that she called yielded over 100 women. Okay. So over 100 women accepted this call to arms, and that's when they formed the National Federation of Afro-American Women. But later on, they had another conference a few months later, and they met in DC. The first one was in Boston. They met in DC, and I know this is a lot of words, and I really tried not to do this, but I couldn't find another way to do this, so this is this. And I know it's small, so I'm going to read out a couple of things. This is the agenda in 1896, and I'm impressed by it. They wanted to institute industrial training, okay, across the country. And these black women were getting together, and they were going back in their communities, but they were getting this agenda, right? And they were going to strategize and contextualize this agenda to their communities. But here's what they wanted to do. And here are the things that they did. They wanted to address corrections institutions. They wanted moral education for African American girls, housing conditions and home purity. They basically wanted to teach them how to be better housewives and mothers. Local reading and debating clubs, anti-lynching, of course, the education segregation in Florida. And also, I would like to point out, Harriet Tubman wanted to address the use of Afro-American versus color. So you can see some of the progression. And then you have Christian mission work as well. So this is one of the agendas held at one of the conventions. Okay? Here's another one, fast forward to 1918. This one was held in Denver, Colorado. They purchased actually Frederick Douglass's home. They addressed black migration from the south to the north. At this time, the Great Migration was happening where black people were moving from the south up into the north because of poor social conditions, also because of lynching. There was missionary work with the local women amongst delinquent females. There was something called a race missionary, but we'll talk about that in a second. Talked about temperance, basically how to be a lady and how to deal with temptation, women's suffrage and the right to vote, National Prohibition Amendment, things of that nature. Of course, anti-lynching is up there again. Okay. So what were some of the things that the National Association of Colored Women do? Okay. And also let me let you know that they're still around. What did they do? What have they done? What do they continue to do? They built schools. They had a particular interest in kindergarten. It was very important, if nothing else, that the kids had a kindergarten to go to. As a matter of fact, Miss Ruffin, and Miss Ruffin was so smart that she would sell her speeches, and she used the money from the speeches that she sold in order to build and create these kindergartens across the country. They also ran orphanages, created scholarships for women to go to college, summer camps, job training, health services. There was an emphasis on mental health as well, which I thought was interesting. Child rearing classes, gardening classes, social spaces for black women. And this is significant. They raised more than $5 million in war bonds during World War I. And that's a lot of money. So they gave a lot, and as a result, they were able to get an influential position in society. By this time, let's go back here and talk to you a little bit. By this time, this is, well, fast forward in my mind and in my presentation, we're in the 1920s, 1930s. So that's from 1896. They've done a lot of work. They've accomplished a lot of things. By this time, they are the largest black women's organization in the country. There are over 300,000 members, okay? They had hundreds, if not thousands, of chapters or clubs at that time. But I want to talk about the philosophy of the National Association of Colored Women. It was thought that if they educated black people, if black people were taught how to present themselves properly in society, that they would not be discriminated against so much, that the racism would cease, because how could you basically attack something or someone so Gentile, or someone who is respectable. So it was respectability politics. That was the philosophy from which they operated from. And that was their approach to reform. So it was about, how do you properly, set a dinner table? How do you properly run a household? And how do you carry yourself? Now this is, like I said, this is around 1930, and they realized that this is not going to be effective for Black people. Black people were still dying in polite ways. They were still found guilty no matter how well they presented themselves in public. They learned that it wasn't about behavior. It was about the fact that they were Black. Okay, so what they ended up doing was they took a pivotal political turn. And that's when, like I said, they learned that gentility and respectability would not equal reform. And they decided that the best way to do this was to change the law per the law. And that's where you see examples like Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, Brown versus Board. And they partnered with organizations who had a heavy lean towards political action. So you had the National Council of Negro Women, led by Mary McLeod Bethune. Okay? And so social justice was the way in which they decided to turn the organization toward in order to create change. I want to give you a couple examples of the political activism that they performed and were able to do. This is, of course, the state of Alabama over here, but fast forward, or not fast forward, rewind, rewind to 1911. This is an issue that was taken up by the National Association of Colored Women across the nation, but particularly the ones in Alabama. They had a mass incarceration problem with young Black men. Young Black men were being imprisoned at higher rates than usual across the country. And what they decided to do was go to the governor and get a facility for these young Black men, because a lot of them were arrested for misdemeanors. So all the young Black men who were arrested for misdemeanors, instead of going to serve hard prison and being on chain gangs, were allowed to go to a place where they could serve their time for their crimes in a less violent manner, per se, in a way where it could intervene so they wouldn't spend the rest of their lives in prison. So that was in 1911. Also, they had a seat at the National War Council, on the National War Council, which is connected, which at the time was connected to the United States government. So they had a say in what was happening with the democracy. And the position that a lot of the women took and presented was, if it's okay for Black people or just Americans in general to go and fight for democracy, for the sake of democracy across the world, then why is it not okay for us to have democracy here in the United States? And shouldn't we fight for that as well? And that position helped them gain a lot of political leverage. And from that, they were able to negotiate some anti-lynching bills. They were able to negotiate getting some buildings built in different parts of the country for women and for kids as well. They also have been invited to the White House because the national government realized their role and their influence in their community. So now I want to focus on the National Association of Colored Women here in Arkansas, or the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. Okay? Arkansas has 13 clubs. It was established, the Arkansas Association of Colored Women was established in 1905, but there was a chapter that had been established since, I believe, 1896 in Fort Smith. Is that right, Ms. Leslie? About 1896. I'm sorry to call y'all like Ms. Leslie, but I appreciate that. But it was around 1896, right when the first National Association of Colored Women's chapter was created, because one of the national members was from the Fort Smith area, or was in the Fort Smith area when it was created. They worked on anti-lynching as a theme, youth education, hygiene and mental health, safety and protection of young girls. And I'll tell you a story about that. There was a young girl who was 13 years old. I believe this is about 1930, in the 1930s as well. And she was sent to prison for whatever crime she committed. It doesn't say what crime that she committed, but at that time, they would send 13-year-old girls to male prisons. And so they didn't have a separate facility. But the Arkansas Association of Colored Women raised money to help get this woman, this young girl, out of that situation. And instead, she was able to go to the Fargo Industrial School, and I believe in Monroe County in Arkansas. So not only were they helping to save her, but they were also bringing awareness to a problem and trying to make a change around it. They developed the Rural Clubs and Extension Committee, and at this time in our country, sharecropping was a big thing. Black people were farmers for the most part. Well, not for the most part. A lot of farmers were black people at this time here. And there was a lot of information about agriculture being developed. So there were home demonstration clubs, and there were co-ops that would help facilitate this information down into the communities. And one of the things that the Arkansas Association of Colored Women wanted to make sure of was that rural communities would be able to get this information as well. The people, the home demonstrators, the home demonstration agents, excuse me, will go into the households and teach people basically, you know, this is a more effective way to do this, that maybe it could be canning things, it could be growing corn or whatever it may be. But black communities didn't get as much money to be able to do that as white communities. And so they were advocates on behalf of the black families in the rural areas in Arkansas. Now more closer to home is the National Association, or the National Association of Colored Women's Club in Little Rock, and that is the Francis E.W. Harper Club. It is located, I believe, on 10th and Cross. And you may not be able to read the sign outside the house, but it says Cultural Arts Center. So this, let me back up. It's the Cultural Arts Center, but it has been, I believe, the official home of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women since the 1960s, 1969. And here in this home, they still have meetings here. This place is also rented out to the community, and so they're serving the community that way. They're still supporting the community. I want to read a list of some of the things that they have done here. They provide food baskets for the needy, award scholarships to high school seniors, provide school supplies to different area schools, present gift baskets to nursing homes as well. I had an opportunity to talk with Ms. Sharon, who is here, a member of the club, and I think they were going to do a beautiful baby contest as well. Still working on that, okay? But the current president of the organization is Ms. Sandra Williams Gibson. Okay? So they're still active today, and I'm sure that people can still join as well. Okay. So back to Ida B. Wells, kind of how it all started, and kind of what it did for me. I guess I kind of want to explain that. When I started out and I saw this button, like I said, I was familiar with her in one capacity, but kind of going through this journey of learning about the different Black women's clubs helped me to understand the importance of telling stories. And that's exactly what Miss Ida B. Wells did. She told the stories. She told the hard stories. She told the stories that, you know, that were not popular in that day or that you would not easily come by. And she did a lot of work for the Black community. So I want to say that I'm inspired by her and what she stood for in her role with the Black community and as a woman. So I feel honored and privileged to be able to tell a story, like I said, that I hadn't heard of before with the Black women's clubs. Okay. And with that, I want to give a special thanks to Ms. Sharon Leslie, She is a member of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women here in Little Rock. She was nice enough to answer my phone call when I randomly contacted her and let us come unannounced to her location. So I want to thank you for that. I appreciate that. Also, Dr. Sharice Jones Branch, she's at the University of Arkansas Jonesboro in Jonesboro, and she provided some information for me as well to kind of help me get this presentation together. So yeah, and I also want to thank you all for coming and sharing your lunch hour with me. Okay. Thank you very much. Have any questions?
Sure.
Yes.
There's an active club here in Little Rock?
There is an active club here in Little Rock. Yes, ma'am.
Members?
Yes, ma'am.
Criteria, requirements, how do you do it? I can give you my phone number, or I can get your phone number. I'd be glad to give you a call. We have the state board meeting coming up on the first Saturday in March, where all the clubs in Little Rock have representatives come. But in our local club, I will have to call you and let you know when our next meeting is the Francis Harper Club. That particular building that she was showing you, I managed it for the organization, for the state organization, but like I said, we are accepting members for the Francis Harper Club. Ooh, I just love it.
Yes.
So
Yes, sir.
how does Ida B. Wells end up? Where does she end up? What is that? Like, she goes on, she does all this in the middle. You guys do like the middle part of her life.
Yeah.
Just, you know,
What happened to Ida?
Where is she at? Where does she live? Where's she based out of? And you know.
Okay. Ida goes back to Memphis eventually.
Okay.
I'm glad you asked that question because I didn't know how to bring it up in the presentation, but Ida was kind of not welcomed with the National Association of Colored Women. 2 years after it was established, 1 year after she helped co-found it, she was not invited to the club. And one of the reasons why she wasn't invited was, for one, she was high profile already, and some of these women were looking to kind of get their name out as leaders in the community. So it would be easier if she wasn't there to some extent. And then number two, in her own words, she called the ladies petty because, excuse me, she felt like having a clean house had nothing to do with social justice. And your house can be clean or dirty. You know, it didn't matter. It wasn't going to make a difference. So she went on to champion her anti-lynching message. She did lots of campaigns in the Black community. But yeah, she ended up doing well. She had a family. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that it's any difference now, 2018, than it was then?
In terms of?
The Black women, with the different education or the way that they're being treated?
I think respectability politics will always be peddled. The better you are, the more you assimilate to American values and standards, the more likely, quote unquote, you'll be looked upon favorably. So I do think that respectability politics will always be, upheld and championed to a certain degree. But kind of like, it's not petty. That's not what I'm not trying to say it's petty, but I just don't believe that is going to change anything. It has to be about dealing with the hard truth and dealing with the issues as they actually are. So do I think Black women, we still have that same issue? I think we have a lot to aspire to when I look at these women and what they did. But I think Black women are doing phenomenal things like they traditionally have done. I couldn't help but think towards politics and the Black women's vote in the Democratic Party as well, and the legacy that these women left in terms of engagement in politics and voting. And you can still see their work today. So I hope that answered your question.
Phone number you call? Club is listed as declined.
Mhm. That's right.
And today, and when we have our state meetings, this past summer, I attended our regional meeting in Oklahoma. That motto still stands. The women of the club encourage women to aspire, you know, when you move up, bring someone else up with you. And although Francis Harper does not have a youth club right now, several of our clubs here in Arkansas do have youth clubs that they encourage and bring them along and try to encourage, especially the young women, a different lifestyle, other than what they see in mainstream media and so forth. So that is still one of the main goals of the organization,
Yes, ma'am.
besides social justice and other issues.
Thank you, Ms. Sharon. Anybody else have any questions? Okay.
All right,
All right, thank you.